I know we're all stoked on great dry fly fishing right now, but guess what's just around the corner? Arguably one of your best shots at tying into a seriously large trout on a fly rod. For an entire winter, these trout have been trapped under the ice in freezing water, but once the ice starts to come off and the water warms up a little bit, the fish go into kind of a feeding frenzy. This ice-off period brings some of the biggest fish in any lake within easy casting distance of the shore. So today on Untangled, you're going to learn all about the gear and tactics you need to take advantage of ice-off fishing. And who knows, maybe you'll stick your new personal best in the net. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant, back for yet another week of podcasting excellence. And I hope y'all are ready for talking about lake fishing, pond fishing, still water fishing in general, because heaven knows I'm not. No, I know I'm on record here on the podcast and a lot of other places saying that I don't fish lakes very often. So then I show up and I'm like, hey, we're going to do an ice-off lake fishing video today. You're probably thinking, okay, Durant, really? Well, give me a minute here. Let me explain myself. Because back in the day, back when I was just a wee critter, just playing around with super cheap rods and driving my dad's truck into the ground just to go fishing, I fished ice-off at reservoirs and lakes religiously. That was my real exposure to still water, was fishing ice-off. And if you don't know what ice-off is, it's just that period in the spring. It can, this year it's probably going to be a little earlier in a lot of places in the West because it's been such a warm winter. But it's that period when the ice starts coming off of the lakes. And the ice isn't all the way off, but usually there's a little ring of open water around the lake and then chunks of ice in the middle. That's ice-off. And there was one lake where I never missed ice-off there. I skipped a couple family get-togethers, skipped more than a few birthday parties for people, just so I could hit that lake at ice-off because it was consistently some of the best fishing I've ever had in my life. And it's one of the places that I miss, not living in Utah anymore. I do kind of miss ice-off at that lake because it was so much fun. I caught a giant tiger trout there one day. I caught a huge cutthroat there one day. There's just a lot of nice fish in that lake. And then on a completely different lake, right at ice-off, I took a buddy and his two kids there one day, and there was enough open water. We actually threw the boat in and fished around some of the drop-offs. And his kids caught so many rainbows, more than we could count. And they just had a blast. And that lake's like that all the time for ice-off. It's just consistently awesome fishing. So, it can be pretty great. I mean, I'll give you one more story here. The best, fastest fishing I ever had for tiger trout was actually during ice-off. And tiger trout, if you don't know what they are, they're a hybrid between a brook trout and a brown trout. And they have that brown trout's moodiness. They can be really finicky, really tough to catch sometimes. But they're completely sterile and they grow pretty quickly. So they get used a lot out here in the West. They get put into a lot of high country lakes where there's too many brook trout or whatever, because they'll eat a lot of little brook trout. But then the tiger trout can't reproduce like the brookies can. So it helps balance out the fish populations, and you end up with bigger fish overall in a lot of the lakes. But these tiger trout, they can grow to huge sizes. The world record's, I think, 21 pounds, and Utah's state record is like 20 pounds. So they can get to just enormous sizes. And there's this one lake where it's got this reputation for just pretty nice tigers, but really, really picky fish. But if you went up there at ice-off, and 2 years in a row, I nailed it at the perfect time. I was up there. There's about 30 feet of open water between the bank and the ice. And I would just sit there and I'd throw my streamer, cast it out onto the ice, let it land there, strip it off, let it just drop right off of that ice ledge into the water. And that thing would get hammered just almost every time. And if they didn't eat it then, I'd just let it drop all the way down to the bottom, and I'd just move it real low and slow across the bottom of the lake, and the fish would just come and scoop it up and just go nuts on it. And there were days up there where it felt like we had a fish on for every cast. I don't know if we did, but that's what it felt like. And most of those fish, I do have pictures of a lot of those days, and most of them were 16, 17 plus inches long. They were nice fish. So, point of all that is, ice-off fishing can be really productive, and I hope I got you sufficiently stoked for it, because I'm stoked for it. I'm ready to go hit it, and that's the point of telling these stories is, yes, I don't fish lakes very often, but I know my way around ice-off because it was a big part of my growth as a fly angler in a lot of ways, was playing around lakes at ice-off, especially when the rivers were too high and muddy to fish during runoff. So it really can be a great time to be on the water. Now, with that in mind, let's dive into the gear and the tactics that you need to take advantage of this so you can go have your own stories to tell about how great your ice-off fishing is. I mean, hopefully what's going to happen to you is you'll listen to the show, you'll have the stuff, and you're going to end up like this guy that I ran into once. I was out on this lake at ice-off, and I was walking out to a point that I like to fish, and he was actually walking back to his truck, and he had a 6-pound cutthroat and an 8-pound tiger trout on his stringer. And I just looked at him and said, "Oh, that's going pretty good." He said, "Yeah, I caught him in like 10 minutes and I'm going to go clean him and go home. It's too easy today." And then he just kept walking. I didn't catch anything that big that day. But he figured it out, man. So maybe you'll end up like that guy and just catch 2 giants back to back. So first thing we got to do, let's dive into exactly why ice-off fishing is so productive. Let's understand some of that behind it. All winter long, your trout are in cold water. They're underneath the ice, so their metabolism slows down. They're just not eating as much. Now, fish in lakes, they've got a little bit easier go with it than fish in rivers because there's not as many strong currents, maybe not much current at all if you're in a pretty small pond. So they don't have to work as hard to just keep moving. They're just kind of chilling. But they're really not terribly active this time of year. They're still eating. Ice fishing is popular and effective for a reason. The fish are still eating. They're just not eating as aggressively as they will, other times of the year. But when that ice starts melting, that means the shallowest parts of the lake, where the ice melts first, the shallowest parts of the lake are back in sunlight and they start to warm up. And the shallowest parts of the lake tend to have tons of food. That's where all your vegetation grows. A lot of your weeds are going to grow there. And all the aquatic insects, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of aquatic insects live in that vegetation. So all the fish in the lake are going to start flocking towards this sudden influx of food to eat all the bugs. And that brings not only the trout, but the bait fish that eat the bugs are going to show up there. And then the trout that eat the bait fish are going to show up there. And then the trout that eat the bait fish are going to show up there. So it brings everything concentrated into the smaller area of the lake because that's where all the food is essentially during this ice-off period. And then I do think there's a big part of fish that just enjoy sunning themselves. After a long winter, they like just stretching out in the shallows and feeling the sun on themselves again. I have no scientific evidence, anything like that, to back that up. It's just my own assumption that it feels right in my head, so I assume that it's right, but that doesn't mean anything. So, but you will see them just chilling in the shallows sometimes, mostly because I think they're just enjoying the sun. Now, even after the ice is melted completely off, it's gone, the fish will still stay congregated close to the shore for a pretty decent period of time until the water warms up a little bit too much. The food chain really starts to kick in the rest of the lake, and then they'll sort of disperse. But you usually have a pretty long window between when the ice comes off and when the fish move to the deeper, cooler water later, early, midsummer. And this is your best chance of catching those big fish because, again, everything's concentrated right there next to the shore. Now, that doesn't mean that all these big fish are just stacked in the shallows like cordwood. It'd be really nice if they were, but they're not. Because big trout, they don't get big by being dumb. They may only have an IQ of 6, but dadgummit, they figured out how to not get eaten by this point. So they're going to continue to do their best to not get eaten. So they're not just going to sit over a weed bed that's in 2 feet of water and expose themselves to eagles or ospreys or crazed anglers like us. Obviously, that comes with a caveat. Sometimes you will see a huge fish just cruising the shallows. Sometimes they do that. Usually that's the exception to the rule. Usually the biggest fish I catch during ice off are in some kind of cover. They're hanging out near a sunken log, around boulders, or most often, where I tend to see most of them is on that transition from where the shallow goes to the deep. They can use those shadows, that color change. They use that to their advantage to kind of hide out, hang out, and away from any overhead predators, but that they can cruise that color change and drop off and just either, zip into the shallows, grab a mouthful of bugs, or, zip into the shallows, grab a couple small bait fish, and then go back to that cover. So that's generally where I see the biggest fish during ice off, is right on that line, right on that color change from deep to shallow water. Okay. And then the other thing to remember too is that if there's still ice on the lake, like I mentioned in that story earlier, a lot of these big fish will just park right under the ice and just sit there and wait for anything to kind of come by. Because again, it's their cover, and they'll just dart out from under the ice, ambush stuff that comes by, and then go back underneath it. So if you can throw your streamer out there onto the ice, strip it back, and let it just drop right at the edge of that ice shelf, so that can be so effective. And I've caught a lot of big fish during ice off doing that. So even though there's a lot of fish, they're in the shallows, they're congregated, they're eating, they're a little less wary this time of year because it's been a long winter. The buffet is finally open, right? The buffet closed because somebody got salmonella and they had to close for a week because the health department's all, oh, well, you need to clean your kitchen. And everybody else is like, I didn't get sick. Let me eat there. It's finally open. They can all go hang out, but they're still, you get in that buffet, you see something sketchy. It's like, oh, well, that guy did get salmonella. Maybe I shouldn't eat here today. Fish are still taking that kind of wary approach to it where they're, they're having fun, but they haven't completely lost their minds yet. So your usual lake fishing rules still apply. Look for structure, cast towards points where the shore juts out in the water, and then those transition points where you go from deep to shallow or just a color change, breaks in weed beds where it goes from a lot of weeds to maybe a sandy or silty bottom. That's going to be money. Yeah, cast towards that stuff. Focus on those areas. Your classic lake rules still apply. Now, as far as getting geared up and actually fishing ice off, it's really not that much different than fishing lakes at any other time of the year. You can chuck nymphs, you can chuck streamers, you do just about whatever you want. And I'll just outline those two rigs because you could go dry dropper. If they're eating dry flies, you could do that. Nymphs and streamers tend to be the most productive for ice off, so that's what I would recommend focusing on. But if you see something different that makes you think, oh, maybe I should fish a dry dropper, maybe it's a really shallow bit of water and there's a lot of fish cruising in it, yeah, go dry dropper. Don't feel like you have to do 2 nymphs under an indicator at that point. But I focus on the indicator rig and the streamer rig because, again, tends to be the best producer for me. So let's look at the streamer rig first. I still like to use the sink tip line in these ice off situations, even though the fish are in closer and you might be able to get that streamer down deep enough just on a floating line with a longer leader. I like that sink tip line because the way it lands in the water, it doesn't just angle down at like a 45-degree angle the way that a streamer does when it lands and it's pulling the leader and then the floating line down. Because then when you strip it back, it kind of pops that fly up really high and it gives it a really exaggerated jigging motion that sometimes can be effective, sometimes can be productive, but a lot of the times I think it's too much. It's so much of a jigging motion and it's pulling it so sharply up that it just doesn't look and feel quite right to me. But that sink tip line keeps everything nice and level. So when you strip the line in, you'll still get a little bit of a bounce, a little bit of a pop on your streamer, but you end up with a lot more natural looking, a lot more controlled movements that I think more closely mimic a lot of bait fish and trigger trout's predatory instincts. So I still stick with a sink tip line at that point because, again, that action, and then a lot of times those fish are going to be they're still eating, they're active, they're definitely on the prowl looking for food, but the water's still going to be pretty cold. Their metabolism's not quite to the summer level yet where they're really going to start moving far to eat a lot of bugs. So low and slow is usually the name of the game. Just get that streamer down low, strip it back to you slowly. Getting a sink tip line allows you to do that. Just get you nice down deep where you can really continue to experiment with the depth and the retrieve, like always, until you figure out what the fish want that day. But I always start off with a low and slow retrieve. And if you'd like to know, if you'd like a reminder of, what the streamer rig looks like, and then we're going to talk about the nymph rig here in a sec. If you want a reminder of what these rigs look like and the easiest way to put them together, we actually have a free rigs and knots pocket guide that has all these rigs diagrammed in it, along with the knots. It's got links to videos and stuff. But if you just want to remember what these all look like and best time to use them, I'll throw a link to that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. It's a really helpful way to commit all this stuff to memory. And then, so you don't have to memorize it. You can just pull it up and be like, oh yeah, I remember this. And it's just a nice handy little guide out there on the water. Now for our nymph rig, really just set up a standard bobber rig with 2 nymphs underneath it. And you can cast that out, just let it sit still and just let it kind of bounce and move with the water. And usually that's enough movement on those flies that it'll look like they're moving and look like they're real and the fish will come up on them. Especially if you see the fish consistently cruising the shoreline, if they're coming by in big schools, then just throwing the bobber out there and letting it sit while the fish cruise around to it can be a really effective way to stick quite a few nice fish. The other thing you can do with this rig is you can slowly strip the flies in and then pause for a few seconds, let them fall back down and get suspended at the depth, and then do another slow strip back in, and just give them a little bit more movement, a little bit of that jiggy action, especially if you tie on like a chironomid or something, make it look like it's trying to shoot up towards the surface to start hatching. That can be a really effective way to fish those kinds of flies. A really good tactic with that indicator rig is just going with a chironomid and then a balanced leech, and then just letting the waves in the water just kind of move them around. You suspend both of those underneath an indicator. You figure out the right depth of where the fish are cruising. That can be absolute money during ice off. And you can get away with tossing that bobber rig with a 5-weight. And honestly, you could probably get away with a streamer rig on a 5-weight too, even with sink tip line. But a 6-weight's going to make a lot of that easier to manage, in my opinion, especially since, it can get pretty windy in the spring. It's like you're fishing in a hurricane sometimes. And if you're casting straight into the wind, that 6-weight can be just a little bit easier to manage if you're dealing with a lot of that. But other than that sink tip line, though, there's nothing in this rig that you don't probably have that you're already using on rivers. So if you're comfortable with, getting your cast out there with your 5-weight on rivers, take that to a lake. You'll probably be fine. If you hook into one of those 8-pound cutthroat trout, it might take you for a run. I personally use my 6-weight on the lakes all the time. I even use 8-weights when I go out and fish Pyramid Lake in Nevada for those really big cutthroat. And some people give me grief because they think that's overkill, but I have had multiple friends catch almost 20-pound cutthroat out there, and I do not want to try and fight a 20-pound cutthroat on a 6-weight. I'd like an 8-weight for that. Thank you very much. Not that I think I'm going to catch 20-pound cutthroats during ice off, but I want some extra heft for really big fish like that. So if you're fishing a place that's got just massive trout, yeah, go 6 or a 7-weight, and definitely will help with the wind. Last but not least, as far as your fly selection, your fly sizing goes, it's going to vary a ton depending on where you're at, but I do fish a lot of streamers, about sizes 4 to 10 during ice off. And if I know there's bigger fish out there, then I'll throw larger streamers. But if I'm fishing ice off at a little pond that's, mostly 12-inch brook trout, and it might have a 15-inch brookie cruising around in there. I'll just throw a size 10 or 12 little leech or whatnot. It definitely can be helpful to cycle through different patterns, different colors of your flies during ice off, because sometimes they will just kind of get keyed in on something. But a lot of the times they're keyed in on flies that really closely mimic the bait fish that are making that big migration to the shallow water where all the bugs are. So if you can get an idea of what the bait fish look like in there and throw streamers that match that, that's going to be a good bet. But it's never a bad idea to start with like black, olive, brown, white. That's just your staple colors of streamers that tend to work just about everywhere. Do the same thing on the lake and you should be good to go. Hopefully, that answers some questions, get you stoked, get you psyched about ice off fishing, because I know I'm ready to go out and hit it. But if you've got any more questions, you got any follow-ups, or you got any tips about ice off that you'd like to share with the audience, definitely drop those in the comments. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. But that is going to wrap up the opening portion of the show this week, and it is time to move into the Q&A section. Every week here on Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, there's a link to send those in to us down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you are watching the video podcast. Ryan from Scotland has our first question, writes in and says, "Hello, Spencer. I am new to fly fishing, and whenever I go out, maybe once or twice a month, I usually go to a fishery at stocked ponds, and I've got a bit sick of it as it is very urban. I'm not quite sure how to find spots to fish, and where I'm from, I can't just search up places to fish because everyone keeps their spots close to them, and the rivers that actually come up are very fished. The fish are very wary, and whenever I go to these famous rivers, I find it hard to catch anything. So I need some help to maybe find some spots for myself to my preferences. Thank you. Live real life." Excuse me, Ryan. This is a great question, man. Thank you a ton for sending it in. And this was actually the topic of our February deep dive in School. And if you're not familiar, School's this online platform. It's the only social media that doesn't suck anymore, in my opinion. And we just run this free group in there where you join. You get to talk to anglers from all over the world. You get to share pictures and stories and tactics and whatnot. Alex and I are in School. You can get a hold of us. We're in there every day chatting and sharing stories and pics with everybody. And then twice a month, we do live events. So we do a live deep dive, which is just a training on one particular topic. And in February, it was how to find places to fish. And we do those live so you can join in, ask Alex and I questions, join the chat with all the other people watching. It's a lot of fun. And then we do a live tying night once a month as well, where we just tie a pattern together and then hang out and talk shop. It's a really, when Alex was like, "Hey, we're going to be doing this School thing," I was kind of like, "Are we?" And I'm glad that we've done it because it has been a blast. It's been really cool. So anyways, I will throw a link to that deep dive we did. We also publish them afterwards as well, so everybody can see them. But I'll throw a link to that deep dive down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. That's going to have a ton of in-depth information that will probably help you out. But with your being in Scotland, I'm sure things are a little bit different out there than they are here in North America. I have no idea what your public access is like over there or how much public water is even available in Scotland. So what I do want to focus on instead is kind of the last part of your question, where you said that the fish are very wary and you find it hard to catch anything when you go to the rivers that get a bit more pressure. And, bottom line, that's kind of fly fishing in a nutshell, man. Fish are wary as a rule. They're suspicious. Finding fish that are eager and happy to eat, even if you don't have the best drift or the best presentation, that's definitely the exception to things, definitely not the rule. And I'm not saying that you're expecting it to be easy. I'm not accusing you of that or anything. I'm just, setting some expectations here. But I would argue that the anglers who learn how to catch fish on really pressured waters are some of the best anglers out there, because they've really figured out that essence of fly fishing, which is put your flies in front of fish and make them look real. And if you can do that on a river that gets a lot of pressure, you are going to exponentially grow as an angler more than more than I have the ability to describe. Really, it's going to help you grow that much. I mean, I learned how to fly fish on two of the most pressured rivers in the West during my growing up years. I did have access to a spring creek that was mostly private as a kid. I did have access to a lot of smaller creeks as a kid, and I got that sort of education. I learned a lot on those creeks as well. I ran around and played there. I had a lot of opportunity to do that, but the rivers I fished the most were also the most convenient, and they were the ones that were the most pressured. So I really learned a lot of what I know about dealing with fish like that on those two rivers that, again, they get more pressure than any other water body in Utah combined. There's just always people fishing those spots. So right out of the gate, when I was going to fish conveniently at some spots, I had to figure out how to get my success that I'd have on those small creeks or the family spring creek and translate that to these two tailwaters that I fish, these two highly pressured, tough fisheries. And I mean, there was one time I spent 2 or 3 days on one of the rivers, camped out there. I was there and dialed in and ready to just catch fish. And I got skunked while literally everybody else on the river was catching fish. And then, I kept track of my fishing journals at the time. There was one stretch where I went 2 months on one of the other rivers, skunked. Didn't even touch a fish for 2 months because they were just tough. And I was learning the hard way, but I was learning. But it's all said and done. I'm a better angler because of that. Not that I'm some kind of expert, amazing angler, but that did make me a better angler. That honed my skills now because I fished on those really tough rivers that were extremely pressured. And that big lesson I learned, presentation, getting my flies to look real. I fall back on those lessons all the time, everywhere I fish now, whether it's, in Alaska and I'm chasing dolly varding up there, or whether I'm hiking deep into the backcountry looking for a big brook trout or golden trout here in the Rockies. Everything that I learned about presentation on those two rivers has carried through to all the other fishing I do. It really was that impactful. So my challenge to you is, definitely watch that deep dive, see if there's other opportunities to try and find different places to fish, but also just figure those fisheries out that get a lot of pressure. Go become great at those places, because I think you're going to become a much better angler for it in the long run. And that's the challenge that, not just to you, but I'd issue to everybody, right? Don't shy away from the rivers that are tough. Those are the rivers that are really going to teach you a lot. So go spend some time on those and really, really challenge and push yourself. So I really appreciate the question, man. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. Brian from Wisconsin has our next question, writes in and says, I love your videos and podcasts. Will the tips you talk about work in the driftless area in Wisconsin, or are they specifically for your location? Thank you for all your advice and videos. They are great. Brian, you're daggum right. Our videos are great. I mean, production quality, on-screen talent, beard game. We're blowing everybody else out of the water. It ain't even close. No, there's tons of great folks making great fly fishing content, and definitely love the feedback from you. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate it, man. Short answer to your question, yes, they will. The stuff we talk about here, 100% is going to work in the driftless, no problem. Now, the longer answer to this is that trout are trout. And wherever you find trout, anywhere around the world, you're going to run into similar situations, whether that's down in Tasmania, over in Europe, here in the Rockies, or even out in the driftless. Okay, because the insects that fish eat, our scuds, our sow bugs, our midges, our caddis, our mayflies, our stoneflies, they all need cold, clean water to thrive. That's where you're going to find these bugs. And since trout need cold, clean water, the trout are going to occur in the same types of rivers that have the bug life that they've evolved to eat. So the cold, clean water all across the world, they are going to be occurring in those places. And because the food sources are the same, that means the food basin is going to be relatively the same. There's going to be differences, like the hatches in Poland are going to be very different from what I'm fishing here in Wyoming, but they're also going to be really similar in a lot of ways. There's still going to be mayflies. There's still going to be midges. I don't know what the stonefly situation's like over there. They may not have the really oxygenated, fast water that stoneflies like, that we have a ton of here in the Rocky Mountains. But, midges and mayflies, caddis, I'm sure it's all very similar across the world. And, just to really drive that point home, there's always going to be local twists and local takes on hatches. Up in Alaska, you fish trout. A lot of the trout fishing is done with flesh flies to imitate dead salmon, or eggs to imitate salmon eggs. That's the vast majority of your trout fishing up there. Now, I have caught rainbows on caddis and mayflies up there. I've caught them during big brown drake catches up in Alaska. But when you're up there in Alaska and you're fishing trout, you really want flesh flies and eggs on hand, because that's the dominant food source in the river, is dead and dying salmon, and then their eggs. And the fish are going to go for that stuff well before the aquatic insects, because there's so much more protein in salmon flesh than there is in a little mayfly. Okay, so they're going to go for that. But honestly, that's what's so great about trout fishing, is that it's relatively the same across the globe. So once you learn it, you really can feel pretty confident about going trout fishing anywhere else. It really is kind of interesting how much it all starts to feel familiar. I was out in New York State a couple of years ago on the Niagara River in February, and that river's huge. It was hard for someone from the West to comprehend just how big that river was. We've got some big rivers here, but nothing like the Niagara. The flows are crazy high. The water's deep. It's just tons of water. And we showed up to fish it, and I was felt a little out of my element at first, especially because we took a jet boat up the river, which I'd never done before. And then we would just turn the motor off and drift down with the current and fish the runs and the pockets that way, and then motor back up and do it again. But once I started throwing streamers and started hooking into fish, it felt very similar to a lot of the other streamer fishing. The fish were a little bit bigger. The water and current were heavier and tougher to deal with, but it was familiar in a lot of ways too. It was awesome to experience something new and to get to see that landscape, but it felt like, seeing an old friend after you haven't seen him for a while. So it was really cool to have that kind of experience. And that's how a lot of trout fishing ends up, where the food base is going to be the same. The trout are going to act the same. So a lot of trout fishing is going to carry over, location to location to location, especially across the country. The biggest difference between the driftless and where I'm at is going to be your timing on hatches. So your hatches are, depending on the year, probably this year, my hatches are going to be ahead of yours because we had such a mild winter. So I'll probably start seeing bugs before the driftless does because they're going to be so much colder. But you also don't have to deal with near the runoff that we deal with, here in the Rockies. So the timing on things will be different, but the general midge, mayfly, caddis, scud, sow bug, that stuff, that's going to remain the same. The tactics are going to remain the same. Fish the seams, look for pockets, runs, riffles, pools. That's all going to remain the same. So really good question, man. Appreciate you sending it in. Jake from Colorado has got our next question. Writes in and says, I recently picked up a 9-foot 7-weight fly rod for streamers and nymphs. I want to put a sink tip line on it, but I'm concerned it would mess with the presentation of the nymphs. Would a sink tip work for alpine lakes and rivers? Jake, this is a good question. Rule of thumb is that sink tip lines are exclusively for streamer fishing. They really don't work for nymphing at all. And the reason for that's fairly simple, because your regular old nymph rig, your two nymphs under an indicator rig, that's set up to give you the maximum amount of feel and sensitivity while also getting your flies down deep into that strike zone where they need to be. Your flies need to sink quickly, but you also need to be able to feel and see when a trout eats one of your flies. You need to be able to have that feedback within the rig. Plus, when the fish go to eat those nymphs, You don't want them to eat the nymph and then feel the pull of a lot of weight against the nymph. That's why we advise against using split shot unless you absolutely have to, because when a fish goes to eat your nymph, and if your rig's got just tons of split shot stacked on it, that split shot is going to offer some resistance when they go to eat that nymph. And they could eat it and spit it out as soon as they feel that resistance, and then you're never going to register the strike on your indicator. It's never going to come through. Whereas if there's no resistance, if they just eat a nymph that's drifting freely, it's heavy, but it's drifting freely, they eat that nymph, you're going to register that much quicker, much sooner on that strike indicator because they're not needing to move so much weight to register that strike. So if you have your nymphs on a sink tip line, they would have to move the nymph, the leader, and then sink tip line, which is heavy and thick and weighs a ton. So it's really not going to give you any sort of feedback that you need. Yes, it will sink quickly, but you're not going to feel or see the fish eating your nymphs on a sink tip line. And then at that point, your indicator is going to get dragged underneath because that sink tip line is going to pull the indicator under the water. That's not going to hold it up. Okay. So short answer is you either need two spools. So one with floating line for nymphing and then one with sink tip line for streamers, or you can just grab a poly leader, Versa leader. It's a weighted leader. You can carry that around, put that onto the end of your floating line when you want to turn it into a sink tip to fish streamers. Those still aren't my favorite. I like the integrated sink tip. I just think it casts a little bit better. I think it presents a little bit better, but there's nothing wrong with using those weighted leaders. They're going to be a fine tool. It's just when I'm fishing sink tip lines, I'm almost always doing it when I'm in a boat fishing a river, so I'm chucking streamers. So I've always got a sink tip rod rigged up and then another rod in the boat rigged up with nymphs, dry dropper, dries, whatever else we're fishing that day. So that's my 2 cents, my experience with it. But that sink tip line is not going to work for the nymphs, but it'll be great for streamers. So appreciate the question. Thanks for sending it in. And with that, folks, it is time to wrap up the Q&A portion of the show and dive into the Live Real Life moment. Every week, we end the show here at Untangled by sharing a story and picture from someone in the VFC audience who's out there living real life. We love to see the adventures y'all are on, hear about them, and just take part in them, because that's the essence of what we do here at VFC, is giving you the tools to go out and create your own Live Real Life moments. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to share with us, there's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment comes to us from Jim, who writes in and says, "Hey VFC, I've been fly fishing for a couple of years now and am still learning something new every time I go out. I noticed the barn swallows swooping low over the water surface in a couple spots and decided to try some dry fly fishing. It looked like a bunch of midges, but I also saw what looked like mayflies. We were on a section where double rigs are allowed, so I figured I'd try an Adams on top and a small Griffiths net underneath. Safe to say it worked. Flung my conglomeration out towards the shallow and boom, like a piranha scene in a movie, drew the line for the set and lifted the stick high. As I start pulling in line, I see two flashes in tandem. Holy cow, I got a double. I start shouting for someone to grab a camera. Pulled them in, and they are both keepers. Super pumped to have a double hit on flies that I tied myself. Still don't know which flies should have been the go-to that day, though. I'll chalk it up to bluegill being easy and variety is the spice of life. Lots of fun at any rate, and definitely made up for the long winter of freezing for empty hooks. Thanks for all the info, and keep it up. What you've created has definitely helped me figure out what I'm trying to do." Jim, that's awesome. I love it. And that might be our first Live Real Life moment with bluegill in it, which I love. Bluegill fishing's a lot of fun, and I've committed to doing more of it this year because I found out there's a lake like an hour from me with a boatload of bluegills in it. So I'm going to go, and if they're big enough, we're doing bluegill tacos. Because if you've ever had bluegill tacos, you know what I'm talking about. That's a delicacy and a half right there. But I love it, man. I love that you got the double. That's so cool when you catch the two at once. And it feels so weird, and you're so worried that your rig's going to break. It's always fun to get those in, man. Appreciate it a bunch. Thank you. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you all so much for being here, listening to the show, watching to the end. Helps us out more than you know. If you want to help us out even more, rate, subscribe, like, tell everybody that you know about the show. Pump it up, talk it up, spread the good word of VFC and Untangled. Let everyone know they can come here and get help, live in real life, because again, that's our goal. That's what we want to do. What we want to see happen is everybody having that opportunity to live real life. And with that, folks, go out on the water, enjoy yourselves, have some fun, catch some fish, and live real life.